Okay, well, I guess this is working. One of my cats is around here somewhere. She was right here a moment ago. There she is. Now she's underfoot. This is the selfish, spoiled princess of a cat. My version of Garfield, basically. She's fat, lazy, selfish, spoiled, pampered, and entitled. She wants food, even though I just filled the dish up. She's not happy with it. She turned her nose up at it and walked away like she often does. I know she's not really hungry because if I were to leave, she would eat the food. She just has to express her displeasure to me while I'm here. And she's a fat cat. She eats all the time, so it's not like she doesn't actually eat the food. She just likes to pitch a fit about it. Anyway. This video is going to be a little different than most of my videos because I'm in between Genesis and Exodus. I am not going to be starting Exodus today. Instead, I'm going to be kind of going over, doing a survey or a quick overview of Egyptian history and how Israelite and Egyptian history interacted over the years, and why we have such a hard time in our academic circles of our smart people today accepting this, and why over the course of the last 100 years or so there has been such resistance built up to the idea that the Israelites were in Egypt or anything like that. Now this is okay, so I don't have a formal lesson plan here. I'm got nothing but my hands. Okay, just me and the camera, a wall behind me, a chair that I'm sitting on. That's it. And I'm not a trained teacher at this sort of thing. So this lesson, this video I'm going to do may not be smooth. This may not be my smooth. I might have to do this again, or I might have to edit this one somewhat because I can't be certain or confident that I'll be able to get all of this out in the most, how do I say, most accessible format to the most people. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of like start talking and kind of try to cover as much of this as I can in a video or two. And of course my videos tend to be about 20 to 30 minutes. So we'll see. We'll see. I mean, I really don't know. So let's just get going and we'll get started here. Okay. So before I went into Exodus, so Exodus obviously starts with the Israelites in Egypt. And they've been in Egypt technically since Joseph got down there, and certainly since Jacob and his crew moved down there. But we're going to start Exodus with a generation skip to the time of right before Moses' birth, and then following, and then of course the time that they take getting out of Egypt even after Moses was born. So there is a lot of overlap here during this time period, and we need to try to figure out how Egyptian history and Israelite history intersected and about when in time that happened. Okay, so one thing we have to understand, of course everybody knows this, is that the ancient countries, ancient peoples, of course, did not follow the calendar system that we follow today. They did not follow BC AD. That was not invented yet. There was no year of the Lord to date a universal calendar around. So the different countries dated their history after the reigns of their various kings. And this is something that just about every country did, at least every country in that region of the world. Okay, so when we then, as Westerners today, in the 19th, 20th, 21st century, go back and look at this stuff that was left behind in that region of the world, in Egypt or in the Levant, the area around Israel, and we find these sculptures and these monuments and these statues and these documents and these archives, we have to form a chronology based on when we think these kings reigned. Because, of course, the people of that day didn't have a universal time scale like we do. and they all follow different systems of dating their kings. They're all different countries. All the kings were vying for power against each other. They all claimed to be a son of God, or maybe sometimes in some cases, God manifest as a man. That was ubiquitous all throughout the ancient world, except for Israel. And one of those, every king that ever lived during that time either claimed to be God himself in the form of a man, or a son of God, or someone appointed to rule on his behalf, God's behalf, or a God's behalf, over a certain group of people. They're all fighting each other, all vying for it. So they all used different systems. They all had different kings. They dated their history around different kings, and of course, they were even they even were striving against their own histories, because kings that came along later would try to possibly sometimes overwrite some of the kings that came before, and so it's all very relative. All right, they didn't have a universal scale of time to measure, and so that we do today. So we try to fit these different kings of these different countries into a calendar that is universal in nature, according to the calendar that we use today. And that's difficult. Okay, that's very difficult. And so it's very relative, and it is not as certain as some people might want you to believe. All right, let's talk a little bit here about the history of archaeology as an academic study. All right, archaeology as an academic discipline is not like arithmetic or astronomy or botany or any other number of categories of things, or agriculture or horticulture or things like that mankind has been engaged in for thousands of years. I mean, we go back to Genesis 4, and Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the ground. Okay, and so we've been doing stuff like that for thousands and thousands of years. Arithmetic, mathematics, science, astronomy, measuring the movements of the stars in the sky, stuff like that. Okay, we've measured that extensively for a very long period of time. Abraham came out of Ur of the Chaldees and probably brought an understanding of advanced mathematics with him, because that region of the world was very advanced. Matt, this is my big fat spoiled pampered princess of a cat right here. See how fat she is? Look at how fat this cat is. That's a big fat cat. Yes. She's not a troublemaker, though, but she is very, very spoiled. Yep. When she came here, she was a tiny little kitten. She was literally left on my doorstep by a couple of people who I think they claimed that they found her outside. They live in the apartment building across from here. They claimed that they found her outside their doorstep, meowing pitifully into the wind. It was December 23rd, the day before Christmas Eve, cold, dark, 9:30 at night. I tend to believe that they actually had the cat, and kind of because they knew that I was a cat man, since I had two cats already who stayed in my window a lot, and they saw my cats from across the courtyard. I think that they probably knew I was a cat man, so they dropped this cat. I believe she was probably meant to be someone else's Christmas present, and whoever it was had second thoughts at the last moment, so they kind of gave her off on me. But she was tiny. I mean, she was a tiny little kitten, probably no more than 4 weeks old, barely old enough to be separated from her mother, and she clinged to me very quickly. It still kind of does, even to this day. So she never really went through that phase that cats do, where the mom tries to distance herself from them, and so she was very clingy to me. One of my other cats ended up kind of taking over the mother role for her, and she's still clingy to this day, and still very spoiled, and never really grew up mentally, maturity-wise. As a cat, she never really grew up. So anyway, so archaeology as an academic discipline has only really existed for about 100 years. Okay, Napoleon Bonaparte had an expedition into Egypt and in that region of the world around the 1800s. It was around that time, during that time, they found the Rosetta Stone, which you probably heard of before, which they were able to use to learn how to translate Egyptian script, because the Rosetta, this stone, this tablet itself was a contract written in a couple different languages, one of which I forget exactly. We already knew how to read, and so by by that, we were able to learn how to read Egyptian, and that was only like in the early 1800s. So the study of Egyptology as an academic discipline, or archaeology in general as an academic field, has only been in existence for about 200 years, actually less. And for the first 100 years of that period of time, it really was, to a large degree, a treasure hunter's game. I mean, there always were some people who tried to take the study of the ancients seriously, but there were always a lot of people who were doing it basically for their own personal gain. And so quite a few of the things that were done, like archaeology as an academic discipline has only existed for about 200 years, and for the first 100 years of that time, it was highly undisciplined. Every man was in it for himself, basically. Every institution, every group was in it for themselves. There were a lot of treasure hunters. There was a lot of lack of controls, like they didn't have specific policies or procedures or methods in place, and they were just kind of making it up as they went. So a lot of stuff they even found at the beginning in the first 100 years was damaged or misplaced or destroyed, or the provenance of these things was damaged to the point where it's questionable. A lot of stuff was archived that they never officially cataloged. We got stuff in museum basements to this day that may have been found decades, if not even centuries ago, that we still haven't properly cataloged or translated or documented. So let's not, it's important to remember that archaeology as an academic discipline has a very short and pretty unglamorous history. So let's not put archaeologists on some kind of pedestal and say that they know what they're doing, because honestly they really don't. Okay. There are many other human areas of discipline and study that we have engaged in as a species, as a culture, for many times longer than archaeology, and that we're much better at, and that we're still not particularly. I mean, even today we have this COVID stuff going around, and if there's one thing that's been very apparent in the last 16 months, is that we really don't have much of a clue. We like to say that we do. We like to feel like we're in control. We like to feel like we know what we're talking about, but honestly, when push comes to shove, we really don't. And that even comes to stuff that we can study and measure. Okay, I've read, right now we're in a big discussion about where COVID come from. And I've been reading, and again, a lot of this gets more technical than I can follow, but I've been reading different articles trying to explain the virus itself in different ways. And different people can look at the same virus and come to different conclusions about where they think it came from. It's the same thing. They're studying the same virus with the same tools, the same instruments, with the same knowledge, the same background, same training as other scientists or other molecular biologists, or whatever you call them, and yet they come to different conclusions. So let's not, and that's something that we can actually observe and measure objectively, and yet our conclusions are still subjective. And so when you come to something like archaeology, which is inherently subjective as its very nature, I mean, we're talking about literally talking about going into a desert, digging through sand and looking for stones and monuments and pots and pans and other things like that that have been literally buried in the sand for 3,000 or more years, and then trying to form some sort of reasonable conclusions about how those items got there or about the people who put those items there. Okay, like that's very uncertain. That's always going to be a guessing game. None of us were there for these events. None of us have personal first-hand knowledge of these events. And so any attempt at putting together the clues about these people or the places where they lived based on the evidence that we can uncover today is always going to be uncertain. And don't let anyone try to convince you otherwise. Don't let anyone try to convince you that we can be certain about some things, because frankly we really can't. And one of the things about this is chronology, because again, these ancient peoples did not measure their years the same way we do today. They did not measure their time the same way we do today. They did not fit their calendars into the calendar system that we use today. So our attempts to put their events into our calendar system are always going to be shaky. Now, we have the benefit in some cases, of being able to date certain events in conjunction with eclipses of the sun or moon, or other astronomical events that happened to occur and were recorded by the ancients, because they were very interested in the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay, they were very, some cultures a little bit more than others, but generally speaking, they were all very interested in the sun, moon, and stars, and kept very close records of these things. and they interpreted signs in the sun, moon, and stars, most notably eclipses, as being portents of disaster for their current king. So when things happened that were bad, that happened in close conjunction with an eclipse, those things tended to be recorded. So in some case, and of course, because the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars can be measured and be precisely and fixed and retroactively done, so we can develop software, computer software to the day, or even not. I mean, some people in years past did this even without computer software. You can track the movements of the stars around the Earth as we track them in the sky, and the sun and the moon through time, and find and date certain points where there would have been eclipses or things of that nature and sort, even without computer software, let alone with computer software, depending on how accurate you are mathematically and how accurate your measurement of the sun, moon, and stars is, and how accurate that is the farther back you go in time. You can actually find on our calendar dates where these eclipses would have happened at these parts in the world and would have been seen by these people and then recorded. So we can fix certain dates in conjunction with astronomical events with a high degree of certainty. We can do that. That's not easy to do, and we can't. And there aren't a lot of instances like that. Okay, even acknowledging that some events can be dated with pretty high precision to astronomical events, and therefore we can figure out where on our calendar these events in time took place. There aren't that many of those kinds of dates. We have to be careful because we can instruct entire chronologies around only a few of these kinds of dates. So even that, we have to be careful and acknowledge that there aren't as many of those as we sometimes like to pretend that there are. The Israelites generally did not date their chronology around the suns, moons, and stars. They were not permitted to do that. That is not how they kept track of time. They kept track of time based on their feasts and their festivals and the way that God told them to, and He did not want them putting too much attention on the sun, moon, and stars. So they did not keep track of time that way. You go through the Old Testament chronology, and you'll find that they kept track of time eventually in the monarchy years based on the reigns of their kings. And since the kings themselves ended up, the kingdom itself ended up splitting in two, there were two sets of kings. There were two kingdoms, two lines of kings to follow for a good chunk of their time until one of them went away. And even there you have differences. Okay, even there, in terms of dating problems, even within Israel, even the difference between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, let alone the other nations around them, different kingdoms measured their king years in different ways. Some kingdoms measured their king years based on the day the king became king, ascended the throne. In some kingdoms, that was not that was an accession year. Like that was a separate year. The king's first year wasn't until after his ascension. Excuse me. Let's say, for example, okay, our New Year's Day is January 1st. So let's say that a king becomes king on September 10th. Some countries, some nations would date the beginning of that king's reign to that day, September 10th of that year. Some would not. Some would wait until the beginning of the next year on their calendar, January 1st in our case. Some would even wait until September 10th of the following year, when the king turns one, basically, in his kingship, and that is the beginning of his first year. It'd be like, again, we don't celebrate a baby's first birthday on the day they're born. They're born that day. They turn one a year after that. Here in our country, we measure our presidents based on the day they're inaugurated. So Joe Biden, our current president, has been president for a little over 4 months now. Because on the day he's inaugurated, his presidency begins. In some countries, this would be like his inauguration year instead of inauguration day, and his actual presidency isn't officially counted as beginning until the following year. And that's just, and again, there's different ways of doing it, and even within this king-based system of counting, different countries had different ways of doing it. And even again, within Israel and Judah split into two at a certain point, and even there they had different ways of counting. And even there, they might have changed their ways of counting and then gone. So it's difficult. Okay, now we are helped by the fact that the books of the Bible do give us extensive information on the reigns of the kings and the dates of the kings. In Kings and Chronicles, technically also in Samuel, although only Saul and David are kings in those books. But in Kings and Chronicles, we do have extensive information on the dates of the kings as measured against each other once the kingdom splits in two. The problem there becomes that for many years, we, and by we I just mean everybody, the world, literally everybody in the world, had forgotten how the scribes who record this information counted these years. So for many centuries, the numbers of the Hebrew kings were very mysterious. And this was not a recent problem. This goes back to when the Jews tried to translate their Hebrew scriptures into Greek in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC into what we call now the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And even then, by that point in time, in the 200s BC or so, they had already forgotten how the scribes of previous centuries were using these numbers of the Hebrew kings, which had already been 300, 400, 500 years old by that time. And they'd already forgotten the secrets to interpreting some of that data. So they actually tried to change some of it. Some of the numbers in Kings about the Hebrew king reigns compared to each other made so little sense to even the people in 200 BC that they tried to brute force changes into the text to change the dates to make it make more sense to them. So this has been a long problem. Okay, now it's good. I'm happy to report today that to a large degree the chronology of the Hebrew kingdom has been determined. A man by the name of Edwin Thiele in the 20th century spent pretty much his entire adult life, 50 plus years, parsing through the data and working out a solution for the chronology of the Hebrew kings, which I think is, from what I can understand, has been more or less widely accepted by most people. And by following his chronology, we can date the Hebrew kingdom back to basically when Saul came along, the first king, and in particular to the reign of Solomon, the son of David. And of course, it was after Solomon's death the kingdom split in two, and he had a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And that occurred at about 970 BC. Excuse me, 930 BC. I'm going backwards. BC dates go backwards. Solomon's reign then began in 970 BC. And of course, he worked back from there to David and Saul. Now, this is important. Now, you might be wondering why I'm skipping ahead here to the kings, which are, I'm in Exodus right now. The kings are coming along much later. But this is important because 1 Kings 6, verse 1 says that Solomon, of course, is the one who built the first temple in Jerusalem. And it says that he began constructing that temple in the spring of his 4th year, which, in his 4th year, or at the spring of his 4th year, which was the 480th year after they came out of Egypt. So if we know the year of Solomon's ascension to the throne, which is 930 BC, according to Thiele's chronology, we now know that his 4th year would be 966 BC, and we can count 480 years back from that to get to 1446 BC as the date of the Exodus. So that is why throughout the studies, these videos I've done so far, I have used 1446 or 1445. Again, there's always a little bit of uncertainty with some of these, because again, their calendars didn't start at the same time. Our calendar starts on January 1st. Their calendar didn't start on January 1st. And so, and their calendar didn't start the same day the Egyptian calendar started. The Egyptian calendar started in July. I'll get to the Egyptian calendar in a minute. Different kingdoms start their calendars at different times. We start ours on January 1st. So because of that, there's always a little bit of uncertainty in the exact year. So I sometimes say 1446, sometimes say 1445 BC, but it was basically then, I usually round off to 1446 BC, that the Exodus happened. So throughout these videos I've done so far, I have been using this 1446 BC date as the year of the Exodus. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just as one last thought, Moses was 80 when he led the Israelites out of Egypt. So then he is born in 1526 BC.